Every job seems to have its challenges. Sometimes they're technical, sometimes they're emotional. The assignment that you were on with us in Manor Cove was a combination of both. The first problem we faced was the fact that we couldn't use strobes. Theoretically, you might conclude that that would make the job easier because we didn't have to set up all the lights. On the other hand, it made it much more difficult. Consider the following. Strobes are daylight balanced, which means the light that they discharge is 5,600 degrees Kelvin. In any room where we use them, that produces very even, very consistent lighting. Without them, the light in the room is subject to all kinds of variables. Where the light is coming through the windows, right down to the paint on the walls, and what kind of light bulbs are in the light fixtures. In that house, we had a kind of avocado green everywhere, including the ceilings. In addition to that, we had various light bulbs, none of which were the same light temperature. And in several of the rooms, when the lights hit the wall, the green to the eye of the camera actually became a very distinct orange. That required massive amounts of post-processing to correct. In addition to that, as I've talked about before, in a situation where the difference between black and white is 4 f-stops, a difference of 16-fold in light between darkness and white, that's well beyond the ability of the camera to compensate. Interpolation, which occurs with the human mind, our automatic correction of the scene so that black and white are properly exposed and all colors look exactly the same, does not occur in the digital world. As a consequence of that, without the ability to use strobes, we were forced to use a technology called HDR, or high dynamic range. Using HDR, essentially you take some number of images and you merge them together using some very sophisticated software. So on that particular job, every image was a combination of 5. The only difference between each of the 5 was that the exposure was different. So in the first one we exposed so that the highlights were perfect. In the 5th one we exposed so that the shadows were as though the human eye would see them. Then they have to be merged together using special software. Unfortunately, that doesn't correct the color shift that occurred everywhere. So it became a much more complicated task from a technical perspective than it would have been had we actually used strobes. There were other issues as well. 18-foot ceilings in a room empty of furniture. That was the case on the first floor. On the second floor, we had tapered ceilings absolutely everywhere, and that creates a sense of space that is totally unnatural to the human eye. The 18-foot ceilings, however attractive they may be, when there's no furniture in the room, the danger is, given the type of lens that we have to use, more about that in a second, the space becomes inordinately empty, large, vacant, and instead of creating a warm, inviting emotional experience, which is of course the point of what we do, instead it creates a very negative space, a sense that you're standing there alone and completely isolated from the universe. That will not incent you to buy a house. The problem upstairs, where the ceilings were more or less cathedral, is very similar, except the emotional experience is different. There's a sense as you're standing in an empty room that's built that way, where the ceiling is coming down on top of you, and the space from the ceiling to the floor is unnaturally small compared to the ceiling itself. The human eye fixes all of that. The camera eye does not. Architectural photography requires that we use what is referred to as a very wide lens, in this case a 10mm lens on our Samsung NX1. It is the equivalent in a full-frame DSLR of about a 14mm lens. When you're using a lens that wide, a number of visual distortions occur that can be counter to the emotional experience you're trying to achieve, especially when the house is empty. The angles that we would take, if there were furniture in that space that would have mitigated that emotional experience, are obviously not there when the house is empty. So, to sum it all up, we had the obvious technical problems of no strobes, color shift, varying light temperatures, colors moving rapidly wherever different light bulbs were used. To that we add the emotional problem of how do you sell a massively empty space? How do you connect with it emotionally for people who were not present at the time of the shoot? So yeah, I would say in the last year that was probably one of the most difficult shoots that we've had.